Welcome to Mining Scripture. My name is Rick, and I do biblical research to help others understand the Bible's teaching. My full study goes into greater depth and can be downloaded from the link in this episode's description. I've used AI to shape this study into an engaging discussion that also preserves the original intent. Imagine you hold a mortgage on a house, right? Like just a standard contract.
Okay, sure.
You agree to make your payments, and in return, you get to live in the structure.
Right.
Now, let's say you hit a rough patch. You default on your payments. You completely break the terms of the agreement.
Yeah, which happens.
Exactly. So the bank steps in, they foreclose, and they just tear up that mortgage contract.
Makes sense.
That specific legal agreement is now entirely obsolete. I mean, it's basically vanished away. But here is the critical question for you to consider as you listen today. When the bank voids the contract, do they send a demolition crew to just bulldoze the house itself?
Oh, wow. No, obviously not.
Right. Of course not, because the house is a permanent structure. The contract was just the agreement about how you interact with that structure.
That's a really great way to frame it.
Thanks. So today we are wading into this massive, frankly fascinating study document. It's filled with historical context and scriptural facts. And it suggests that for centuries, millions of people have fundamentally believed that God bulldozed the house simply because an old contract expired.
Yeah, it is. It really is one of the most pervasive assumptions in modern religious culture. I mean, the standard narrative that most people walking down the street would give you is that there was this ancient era.
Like the Old Testament times.
Exactly. A time of harsh, rigid laws, stone tablets, and strict rules that were meant exclusively for the nation of Israel.
Just for them.
Just for them. And then the narrative goes, a new era arrived with Jesus. And he supposedly swept away all of that ancient infrastructure, replacing it with a completely different, relaxed standard for everyone else, one that's built only on love and grace.
And that right there is exactly what we were putting under the microscope in this deep dive.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. We have this incredible source document to pull from. And our mission today is to ask a very profound core question. Does God actually operate with a sliding scale of morality?
Right.
Like, does he have different standards depending on the era you were born in or, whether your DNA is Jewish or Gentile?
Right.
We need to figure out if this popular narrative actually holds up when you look at the original texts.
Well, to really test that premise, we first have to establish the nature of the rule maker himself.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we start?
Well, if the rules of the universe drastically changed, it implies that the architect of those rules changed his mind.
Which makes logical sense.
It does, but when we look at the foundational text, we hit an immediate roadblock with that theory. For example, Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8 makes this incredibly definitive, uncompromising statement.
What does it say?
It says, Jesus Christ the same yesterday and today and forever.
Oh, wow. So the core identity of the divine is absolute consistency.
Exactly. And it goes further than just his identity, actually. It extends to his actions. Yeah, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 14 states, I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing taken from it.
Okay, so if you pair those two concepts together, a very logical problem emerges for that popular narrative we were just talking about.
A massive problem, yeah.
Because if God is fundamentally unchanging and his actions are established forever, how could the core standard of what constitutes moral right and wrong simply flip on its head?
It defies the internal logic of the text. I mean, to suggest God would mandate a strict set of moral laws for one group of people in one millennium and then completely abolish those laws for a different group in the next.
Hold on, I have to play Dylan's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
Because I am looking at these ancient texts,
right,
and I can almost hear someone shouting at their speakers right now.
Yeah.
What about the very words of Jesus?
Okay, which verse?
In Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. Jesus literally stands in front of a crowd and says he came to fulfill the law. I mean, if I fulfill my car loan, I don't keep making payments, right? The obligation is over. The contract is done. So why doesn't that modern understanding of fulfilling a contract apply here?
That is the exact cognitive leap that almost everyone makes. And frankly, based on our modern English vernacular, it is a completely reasonable leap.
Right, because when we hear fulfill, we think terminate upon completion.
We do. But we have to remember, we aren't reading a modern banking contract here. We are reading first century Greek.
Okay, so what's the original word?
The word used there is plerou, And it doesn't mean to terminate.
It doesn't.
No, it actually means to fill to the brim, to bring to its ultimate intended expression, or to fully realize something.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and to really see this, we have to look at the immediate context. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 19, Jesus says, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill."
Oh, I see. So if fulfillment abolish, that sentence becomes absolute nonsense.
Oh.
He would basically be saying, I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to abolish the law.
It would be a total contradiction in the exact same breath. And he immediately reinforces this in the very next verse.
What does he say?
He tells the crowd that until heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle will pass from the law.
And a jot and a title, those are like the absolute smallest pen strokes in the Hebrew alphabet, right?
Exactly, the tiniest grammatical marks. And then he delivers the clincher. He says whoever breaks the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great.
Man, that is decidedly not the language of someone who is permanently retiring a legal standard.
Not all.
He's doubling down on it. So if pleroo doesn't mean bringing the law to an end, how does the rest of the text actually define it?
Well, Paul provides the clearest definition of this in Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. He explains the actual mechanics of how this works. He says that he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. And then he goes on to explicitly list commandments. Do not commit adultery, do not kill, do not steal.
Right, the classics.
Right. And he argues that all of these are comprehended or just wrapped up in the simple phrase, love your neighbor as yourself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he concludes by stating, therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law.
Wait, let me see if I can process this with an analogy from the source material, because this is a massive shift in perspective.
Sure.
Think about the baptism of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 3, verses 13 through 15, Jesus walks up to John the Baptist at the Jordan River.
Right.
And John is completely thrown off by this. He basically tells Jesus, hey, I'm the one who needs to be baptized by you.
Yeah, he tries to stop him.
Exactly. But Jesus responds by saying, permit it to be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness.
Ah, there's that word again.
Yes, Jesus fulfills righteousness by being baptized. But nobody today looks at that event and says, well, Jesus fulfilled baptism, so we never have to baptize anyone ever again.
Right, that would be absurd.
He checked the box for humanity, No, people still practice it globally.
That perfectly illustrates the mechanism at play here. Jesus fulfilling baptism didn't render the act obsolete. It demonstrated the perfect, completed model of what that act was actually supposed to be.
So it's an example to follow, not an excuse to stop.
Precisely. And by that exact same logic, Jesus fulfilling the moral law by living a perfectly sinless life, driven by absolute love, it doesn't bulldoze the law.
Right.
It just provides humanity with the ultimate blueprint of what that law looks like when it is lived out flawlessly.
That makes so much sense.
In fact, Paul states point blank in Romans chapter 3, verse 31, do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid, yeah, we establish the law.
Okay, but this creates a massive tension that we need to resolve.
What's that?
Because if the law is established, if it wasn't destroyed like we just discussed, then what on earth was the Old Covenant?
Good question.
Because I am looking at Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13. And it clearly states that a new covenant has made the first one obsolete and that the old one is ready to vanish away.
Yes, it does say that.
How can we have an obsolete, vanishing covenant sitting right next to an eternal, established law?
We resolve it by recognizing that they are two completely different things.
Wait, really?
Yes. This is the historical misunderstanding that has derailed so much theological discussion. The Old Covenant is not the 10 Commandments.
Okay, I'm cracking.
The covenants were the agreements about the commandment.
Oh, this goes right back to the mortgage analogy we started with.
Exactly.
The 10 Commandments are the house. They are the permanent structure. The Old Covenant is just the mortgage paperwork. It's the agreement detailing how humanity was going to interact with that perfect structure.
And that specific paperwork was severely flawed.
How so?
Well, Hebrews chapter 8, verses 7 and 8 explains precisely why a new covenant was required. It says, for if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. And then the author identifies the exact location of the flaw. He says, because finding fault with them, he says, behold, the days are coming.
Finding fault with them as in the people. not the law.
Exactly. The historical texts are unanimous on this point. No one has ever found a flaw in the handwriting of the divine.
Right.
Paul, long after the resurrection, writes in Romans chapter 7, verse 12, that the law is holy and just and good. A law cannot be simultaneously holy, just, perfect, and also be a faulty, obsolete relic that needs to be discarded.
So if the law was perfect, but
Yeah.
the people were the problem, how exactly did the people break the contract? Like, what was the fatal flaw in the paperwork they signed?
To understand that, we have to look at the psychological and cultural environment at the base of Mount Sinai.
Okay, let's go there.
If we go to Exodus chapter 19, verses 3 through 8, the Israelites have just been miraculously delivered from Egypt. God calls Moses up the mountain and proposes a covenant.
He offers them a deal.
He does. He says, "If you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be a special treasure to me." God is offering terms. And the response of the people is absolutely fascinating.
What do they say?
They confidently declare, "All that the Lord hath spoken, we will do."
We will. I mean, that doesn't sound terrible on the surface, all right? It just sounds like they are agreeing to the terms. Why is that the fatal flaw?
Because of what it reveals about their mindset. It was a promise made by deeply flawed, carnal human beings who were relying entirely on their own willpower.
And by carnal, we mean?
Let's define carnal here. It simply means operating out of human nature, driven by physical senses and natural inclinations, without any spiritual, supernatural assistance.
Got it.
These people had just spent 4 centuries absorbing the culture of Egypt. They were traumatized, prone to panic, and highly unstable.
Yeah, not in a good headspace.
Not at all. Yet in absolute arrogance, they believed they could perfectly execute the holy laws of the universe using nothing but human grit. They were essentially saying, we don't need any divine help to be perfect. We can do it ourselves.
And we know how well that worked out. I mean, they were literally melting down gold to build a calf to worship before Moses even made it back down the mountain with the physical contract.
It was a disaster. The contract was doomed the moment they signed it with their own self-reliance. So the Old Covenant wasn't a bad set of laws given by God. It was a relational agreement built on the wildly insufficient, flesh-driven promises of the people.
Okay, let me push back on something, though, because this raises a pretty big chronological issue.
Let's hear it.
We keep talking about the 10 Commandments as the house in our analogy, but a lot of people argue that the house wasn't even built until Mount Sinai. They argue that the moral law didn't exist until God explicitly spoke it and carved it into those stone tablets in Exodus.
That is a very common chronological error. But the historical texts provide extensive evidence that the house was standing centuries before Moses was even born.
Really? How so?
Look at the life of Abraham. He lived over 400 years prior to the events at Sinai. But Genesis chapter 26, verse 5 states explicitly, "Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws."
Wait, 4 centuries before Sinai? How could Abraham be keeping commandments and laws that supposedly hadn't been invented yet?
He couldn't. It defies basic logic. The texts actually build a very tight logical loop to prove the pre-existence of the moral law.
Walk me through it.
First, we need the biblical technical definition of sin. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4 provides it. It says, "Sin is the transgression of the law."
Okay, so sin by definition is the act of breaking the law.
Precisely. Then we pair that with Romans chapter 4, verse 15, which establishes a foundational legal principle. It says, "Where there is no law, there is no transgression."
Oh, I see. Meaning, if there isn't a speed limit posted, a police officer cannot physically pull you over and write you a ticket for speeding.
Exactly.
The crime cannot exist without the parameter.
Right. So if we apply that legal parameter to the book of Genesis long before Moses, we see a massive problem for the idea that the law didn't exist.
Give me an example.
The text points to the men of Sodom in Genesis chapter 13, verse 13. They are described as exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord.
Right.
If there were no laws against violence, theft, or sexual immorality, how could their behavior be legally categorized as sinful?
That's a great point. Or look at the story of Cain and Abel. Cain murders his brother. God confronts him and tells him that sin is crouching at his door.
Exactly.
How could Cain be guilty of murder if the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," was still thousands of years away from being established?
It doesn't make sense. Or consider the incredible psychological resilience of Joseph in Egypt.
Oh, with Potiphar's wife.
Yes. This is a young man sold into slavery, far from his family. Potiphar's wife tries aggressively to seduce him. If there was no codified moral law, he easily could have rationalized the affair as a way to secure his safety and status.
Absolutely, he could have just played the game.
But in Genesis chapter 39, verses 7 through 9, he refuses her and says, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?"
Wow.
Joseph possessed a profound, internalized understanding that adultery was a violation of the divine standard long before the seventh commandment was ever chiseled into granite.
So what you're saying is that the moral law was woven into the fabric of human conscience from the very beginning.
It was.
But if that is the case, why the massive theatrical display at Mount Sinai? Why the thunder, the smoke, and the physical stone tablets if everyone already knew the rules?
Think about what happens to an unwritten, internalized moral compass when a population is subjected to 400 years of brutal slavery.
Oh, right.
Especially in a culture deeply entrenched in idolatry and polytheism. The Israelites' moral compass had been completely demagnetized. They had lost their spiritual moorings.
That makes total sense.
The spectacular display at Sinai was God basically re-educating a traumatized, amnesiac nation. He had to take the internal principles that had guided Abraham and explicitly codify them into external boundaries.
Like a parent putting up baby gates in a house.
Oh, that's good.
You don't put up baby gates for an adult. You put them up for a toddler who doesn't understand the intrinsic danger of the stairs.
That is a very apt comparison. Paul even uses similar language in his letter to the Galatians. He calls the law our tutor or schoolmaster to bring us to Christ.
To teach us the boundaries again.
Right. The explicitly codified law was designed to highlight their failures, to show them how far they had drifted, and to make them realize they desperately needed a savior. But the laws themselves were always eternal.
Okay, this brings us to a major pivot point in the document.
Where's that?
Well, if the people's promise to keep the law failed so spectacularly at Mount Sinai, if their arrogant "we will do it" was the fatal flaw that broke the old covenant, how does the new covenant actually fix the problem?
That is the big question.
Because as we just established, the new covenant doesn't tear down the house. It doesn't replace the eternal moral law. So what is the actual upgrade here?
Here's where it gets really interesting. The upgrade is a complete overhaul of the promises.
Okay.
To understand the mechanics of the new covenant, we have to examine the specific language used in Hebrews chapter 8, verses 10 through 12.
Mm-hmm.
If you listen closely to the pronouns, you will hear the most monumental shift in human history.
I'm listening.
Under the old covenant at Sinai, the people arrogantly stated, "We will do," but listen to the new covenant. God says, "I will put my laws into their mind. I will be to them a God. I will be merciful to their unrighteousness. Their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more."
I will.
Exactly.
It completely removes human willpower from the driver's seat.
Yeah.
The new covenant is 100% God making the promises and God doing the heavy lifting.
It is the exact same law because God's character hasn't changed. But the location of the law undergoes a radical relocation.
A relocation.
Yes, it is taken off of external stone tablets, which can only stand outside of you and condemn you when you inevitably fall short. And it is transplanted directly into the human mind and heart.
Wait, let me make sure I'm grasping the practical reality of this.
Sure.
It sounds like the difference between driving the speed limit purely out of terror because you see a police cruiser in your rearview mirror.
Right, which is forced external compliance.
Exactly. Versus driving the speed limit because you are driving through a neighborhood and you genuinely care about the safety of the kids playing on the sidewalk.
Oh, that's a beautiful way to put it.
The action is the same. The speed is the same. But the internal motivation has been completely transformed from fear to love.
That is precisely the transformation the text is describing. And the crucial point here is that a human being cannot generate that internal transformation on their own.
We just don't have it in us.
We don't. It requires what the theological text calls spiritual regeneration. It's not a self-help program. It's a divine transplant.
It's God literally rewiring our default desires.
Yes.
Which leads us to one of the most fascinating allegories I have ever come across in these historical texts.
You too, sons.
Yes. The narrative actually uses a deeply personal family drama to illustrate this massive shift from human effort to divine promise. The story of Abraham's two sons.
Oh, Paul's allegory in Galatians chapter 4, verses 22 through 31 is an absolute masterclass in theological synthesis.
It really is.
Paul takes a well-known historical event and reveals its profound spiritual architecture. He points out that Abraham had two sons, Ishmael, born of the slave woman Hagar, and Isaac, born of his free wife Sarah.
Okay.
Paul explicitly states that these two women and their sons represent the two covenants. Ishmael represents the old covenant from Mount Sinai, and Isaac represents the new covenant.
We really need to unpack the psychological weight of this story to understand why Paul uses it so effectively.
Let's do it.
You have Abraham and Sarah. God has made a staggering promise. They're going to have a son, and through that son, a massive nation will be born.
A huge promise.
But years are ticking by. Sarah's approaching 90 years old. Abraham is pushing 100.
Right.
From a purely biological, scientific, human standpoint, this promise is entirely impossible. The window has closed.
It's shut tight.
So panic sets in. Instead of trusting that God has the power to achieve the impossible, they decide they need to step in and help God out.
They fall back on human logic. They lean on the flesh.
Yes. Sarah takes her Egyptian handmaid, Hagar, and gives her to Abraham. Abraham sleeps with Hagar, she conceives, and Ishmael is born.
Right.
They tried to fulfill a divine promise using human biology, human scheming, and human effort. And Paul argues that this is the exact spiritual equivalent of what happened at Mount Sinai.
It's a perfect parallel.
God offers a beautiful, holy covenant, and instead of relying on God for the power to keep it, the Israelites basically said, we've got this. We can manufacture our own righteousness using our own flesh.
But God refused to recognize Ishmael as the child of the promise.
Why?
Because the promise was designed to display God's power, not human ingenuity. Which brings us to the birth of Isaac. When Isaac was finally conceived and born to Sarah, there was no human explanation for it. It was a biological impossibility.
A genuine miracle.
A literal, undeniable miracle. God brought forth new, vibrant life out of a womb that was, for all intents and purposes, entirely dead.
And here is where the metaphor hits incredibly hard. Just as God used his spirit to create physical life in a dead womb, he uses his spirit to create spiritual lives. You know, a genuine desire for obedience in a dead, stubborn, carnal, human heart.
That is the pivotal realization of this entire study. Isaac was born after the spirit, while Ishmael was born after the flesh.
Wow.
Because our human nature is inherently flawed and self-serving, we possess zero capacity to attain the righteousness required by God's eternal law on our own.
It's impossible.
Functionally impossible, just like a 90-year-old woman giving birth. We must be born of the Spirit. Any attempt to obey God's moral law through sheer willpower, religious checklists, or strict human discipline is an old covenant operation.
It's an Ishmael.
Exactly. It only produces a child of bondage.
Which completely flips the modern religious script.
How so?
Well, I see people online constantly accusing anyone who strives to keep the biblical commandments of being stuck under the old covenant.
Oh, all the time.
But based on Paul's allegory, the truth is the exact opposite. The people trying to keep the rules in their own strength, just white-knuckling their morality, they are the ones under the old covenant.
Yes.
But the person who naturally keeps the moral law, because God's Spirit has radically altered their internal desires, that person is the true child of the new covenant. They are the Isaacs.
This profound distinction helps decode a phrase that has caused endless confusion and debate for centuries.
I think I know where you're going with this.
If believers under the new covenant are still expected to keep the moral law, albeit through the supernatural power of the Spirit, what did Paul mean when he famously declared in Romans chapter 6, verse 14, that we are not under the law, but under grace?
I'm so glad we are tackling this, because this is where the speeding ticket analogy from the text comes into play, and it clarifies this concept beautifully.
Walk us through it.
Let's say I am driving down the street. I am completely ignoring the rules. I am doing 90 miles an hour in a clearly marked school zone.
Very bad idea.
Terrible idea. I get pulled over, and the police officer writes me a massive catastrophic ticket. I have to appear in court.
Okay.
There's no denying the evidence. The radar gun caught me. I am guilty. I am facing a fine that will bankrupt me or possibly even jail time.
Right.
As I stand before the judge waiting for the gavel to drop, the law is actively condemning me. In every legal sense, I am currently under the penalty of the law.
You are bearing the full weight of its condemnation.
Exactly. But right before the judge passes sentence, an absolute stranger walks into the courtroom.
Okay.
He steps up to the bench, pulls out his own checkbook, and pays my impossible fine in full. The judge stamps the receipt, looks down at me, and says, "The debt is satisfied. You are free to go."
Amazing.
I am now entirely free from the condemnation. I am no longer under the penalty of the law because of this stranger's incredible grace.
That is grace, yes.
But here is the critical logical question. Does that judge lean over the bench and whisper, "Hey, since that nice guy paid your fine, you never have to drive the speed limit again. Feel free to do 100 through the school zone on your way home"?
No, it's an absurd proposition.
Of course it is.
If you walked out of that courtroom, got in your car, and immediately broke the law again, you wouldn't just be breaking a rule, you would be demonstrating absolute contempt for the stranger who just sacrificed their wealth to save you.
Exactly.
And practically speaking, you would find yourself right back under the penalty of the law for the new offense.
So being not under the law has absolutely nothing to do with the law itself vanishing.
Nothing at all.
It simply means you are no longer crushed beneath its penalty because Jesus stepped into the courtroom and paid the fine.
And Paul proves this is his intent. Right after he says we are not under the law but under grace, he anticipates this exact misunderstanding.
Oh, he knew it was coming.
He did. In the very next verse, Romans chapter 6, verse 15, he asks, "Shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace?" And he emphatically answers his own question, God forbid.
God forbid, wow.
Yeah. And understanding this legal dynamic gives us the key to unlocking another highly contested text.
Which one?
In Colossians chapter 2, verse 14, Paul uses some very striking imagery. He writes about a handwriting of requirements that was against us being nailed to the cross.
Right.
For generations, many teachers have pointed to this verse and claimed, see, the handwriting of requirements is the Ten Commandments. God nailed the moral law to the cross and abolished it forever.
But if we follow the logic we've established, why in the world would God nail his own perfect, holy, eternal character to an execution instrument?
He didn't. And a linguistic dive into the original Greek text completely dismantles that theory.
What's Greek say?
The phrase translated as handwriting of requirements is the Greek term kairografon toa dogmason. If you look at how this term was used in the ancient world, it is not a religious term for the moral law. It is a highly specific, secular, legal term.
Really? What does it translate to?
It literally translates to a certificate of debt, a handwritten promissory note, or essentially a criminal's rap sheet.
So it's the physical record of our crimes.
Exactly. In ancient Roman courts, when an accuser brought charges against a defendant, they didn't just make verbal allegations, they presented the kairografon.
The paperwork?
The paperwork. A physical document, often written on papyrus or wax tablets, detailing the exact debts owed or the specific crimes committed. It was the undeniable evidence of guilt.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, historical accounts of Roman crucifixion practices reveal a fascinating detail. When a criminal was crucified, they didn't just nail the person to the wood.
What else did they do?
They also nailed an inscription above their head detailing the specific crimes that had earned them this brutal death. They nailed the kairografon to the cross for all to see.
So when Jesus was hanging on the cross at Calvary, the spiritual reality was that it wasn't the Ten Commandments being nailed above his head. It was our rap sheet.
It was the comprehensive, exhaustive record of every single time we broke the eternal law.
That is wild.
2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 21 captures this profound exchange. God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him.
Unbelievable.
Christ took our certificate of debt, our spiritual speeding ticket, our kairografon, and he paid it with his own blood. He nailed our overwhelming guilt to the cross, completely destroying the record of our sins. He did not destroy his Father's house.
That is an incredibly vivid, powerful image. But it steers us directly into the eye of a theological hurricane.
The grace versus works debate.
Exactly. The classic debate between grace and works. If we are saved entirely by this unmerited grace because Jesus paid our impossible fine, where do our works, our day-to-day actions, our obedience to this eternal law actually fit into the equation?
It's a fair question.
Do they matter at all?
The historical study addresses this by forcing us to clearly define three crucial concepts: justice, mercy, and grace. And they use a very grounded, practical scenario to differentiate them.
I love this part. I called this the stolen bike scenario, and it really helped me lock these definitions into my brain.
Let's hear it.
Let's say I come over to your house, I sneak into your garage, and I steal your expensive bicycle.
I would be calling the authorities immediately.
As you should. So you catch me, the police arrive, I'm arrested, and I go to jail for theft. That is justice. I got exactly what I deserve for violating the law.
The scales are balanced.
Exactly. Now, scenario 2. I steal your bike. You catch me red-handed, but for whatever reason, you feel immense pity for me.
Okay.
Maybe you see I'm struggling. So you tell the police to stand down. You let me walk away without pressing charges. That is mercy. I did not get the severe punishment that I rightfully deserved.
Right, you avoided the penalty, but your situation hasn't necessarily improved beyond that, so how does grace differ?
Scenario 3. I steal your bike. You catch me. You decide to show me mercy by not calling the cops.
Okay.
But then you take it a massive step further. You reach into your pocket, pull out the title and keys to your brand new car, hand them to me and say, here, take this too.
Wow.
You let me go.
Yeah.
And you bestow upon me a staggering, completely unearned blessing. That is grace. Getting a phenomenal blessing that I absolutely unequivocally do not deserve.
It is the ultimate unmerited favor, and this is exactly how Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 frames our spiritual reality. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast.
Right.
We all broke the moral law. The established penalty for that treason is death. We are sitting on death row. We cannot retroactively earn our way out of a death sentence by suddenly deciding to be model prisoners.
The fine is already pending.
Exactly. We are saved entirely by the unmerited, extravagant favor of God who stepped in and paid the penalty for us.
But if works play absolutely zero role in the cause of our salvation, does it matter how we live afterward?
It matters immensely, but we have to understand the sequence. Works are not the root of salvation. They are the inevitable fruit of it.
The fruit. Okay.
The study brings in the rigorous logic of James chapter 2, verses 14 through 26 to explain this dynamic.
What does James say?
James poses a highly practical question. What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him?
Right.
He uses the example of seeing a fellow human being naked and freezing on the street and cheerfully saying to them, be warmed and filled, while refusing to give them a coat or a meal.
That kind of faith is practically useless. It's just empty words.
Exactly. James concludes, thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead.
Dead faith.
He even makes the chilling observation that demons believe in God. They know he exists, and they even tremble in fear of him. But that demonic belief doesn't produce obedience or love.
Wow, that's heavy.
True, saving faith, the kind that actually receives grace, always initiates a transformation. Works are the vital, visible heartbeat of a living faith. If your supposed faith isn't organically producing a desire to obey God's moral law, James argues that you are carrying around a spiritual corpse.
What's truly fascinating is that this isn't some new paradigm invented halfway through the timeline.
No, it's not.
The sources point out that God's method of salvation has never fluctuated. It's a massive misconception that people in the Old Testament were saved by frantically sacrificing animals and keeping rules, while people in the New Testament get to be saved by grace.
A huge misconception.
If you look at Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, it explicitly says that Abraham believed in the Lord and he accounted it to him for righteousness. Abraham was saved by faith.
The continuity is striking. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7 tells us that by faith, Noah became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. From the very beginning of human history to its end, the mechanism of salvation has always been grace through faith, and the evidence of that faith has always been obedience.
This historical continuity brings us to what I think is one of the most contentious issues online right now, the Gentile question.
Oh boy, here we go.
If the moral law is eternal and the method of salvation is identical across all eras, how do we address the overwhelming argument that God operates two different tracks?
Two tracks.
Yeah. The argument is that the Ten Commandments were a specific covenant for ethnic Jews and that Gentiles, non-Jews, operate under a separate, lighter set of rules. Usually people point to the law of love or the Jerusalem Council in the book of Acts.
Right. It is a very prevalent theological framework, often referred to as dual covenant theology.
Yes.
It essentially posits that God manages two separate households with two different rule books. But when you subject this theory to the writings of Paul, it completely disintegrates.
Let's tackle that Jerusalem Council argument head on because it comes up constantly.
Let's do it.
In Acts chapter 15, the early church leaders are dealing with an influx of Gentile converts, and they convene to decide what is required of them. They send out a letter advising the Gentiles to abstain from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality.
Correct.
People point to that short list and say, look, they didn't tell the Gentiles to keep the Ten Commandments. They didn't mention honoring parents or keeping the Sabbath. They're not stealing.
The author of the study counters that logic with a devastatingly simple question.
What is it?
Because the Jerusalem Council didn't explicitly mention the commandment against murder in that letter, Did it suddenly become perfectly acceptable for Gentile Christians to go out and murder people?
I mean, obviously not. That would be absolute chaos.
Exactly. The context of Acts chapter 15 isn't the council rewriting the eternal moral law. They were addressing highly specific, culturally ingrained pagan temple practices that were causing immediate, intense friction in the newly mixed Jewish-Gentile congregations.
Oh, so it was about cultural integration.
Yes. They were dealing with cultural integration, not abolishing the foundational definition of sin. To see how God actually views the relationship between Jews and Gentiles in the New Covenant, we have to examine Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 19.
Okay, this is the famous passage about the dividing wall, right?
That's the one.
Paul is writing to Gentile believers, and he reminds them of their history. He says they used to be aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise.
We're outsiders.
Outsiders looking over the fence. But then Paul reveals what the cross actually accomplished. He says that Christ, through his blood, has broken down the middle wall of separation.
He didn't build a second house for the Gentiles.
Exactly. He knocked down the wall to make them one body.
The climax of that passage is in verse 19. Paul declares, "Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God."
Fellow citizens.
Fellow citizens. This represents a monumental shift in identity. Paul uses a brilliant horticultural metaphor in Romans chapter 11, verses 19 through 24 to explain the mechanics of this citizenship.
The olive tree.
Yes, the olive tree. He describes Israel as a cultivated, deeply rooted olive tree. Because of unbelief, some of the natural branches representing unbelieving Jews were broken off. And then, wild olive branches representing believing Gentiles were grafted directly into the trunk to share in the root and the rich sap of the tree.
The Gentiles weren't planted in a separate garden out back with different soil and different rules.
No.
They were surgically grafted right into the original ancient tree.
There is only one tree, there is only one commonwealth. Galatians chapter 3, verse 29 makes this spiritual reality indisputable.
What does it say?
It says, "And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." If you belong to Christ, your biological DNA is irrelevant. You are legally and spiritually counted as the seed of Abraham.
Which leads to a conclusion in the text that honestly might bend a few minds.
Lay it on me.
When Paul writes in Romans chapter 11, verse 26, that all Israel will be saved, he is not making a geopolitical statement.
No, he's not.
He is not saying that every single person with Jewish ancestry gets an automatic free pass into eternity.
He clarifies this explicitly earlier in Romans chapter 9. He states that they are not all Israel who are of Israel. He establishes that it is the children of the promise who are counted as the true seed.
Right, so when the text says all Israel, it means all believers.
Everyone.
Everyone who has exercised true faith in Christ, whether they were born Jewish or Gentile, has been grafted into the family line of Abraham. They are all citizens of spiritual Israel.
And the study actually makes the bold claim that, in a strictly covenantal sense, there will be 0 Gentiles in heaven.
Wow.
Because every single person who is saved has been adopted, grafted in, and made a full-fledged citizen of Israel.
It thoroughly dismantles the dual covenant theory.
It really does.
Yeah.
The biblical narrative presents one God, one Savior, one tree, one new covenant, and one eternal moral law written by the Spirit onto the hearts of one unified people.
Wow. Okay, if we accept that premise, that all believers are grafted into this one tree, subject to the same eternal moral law written on the heart, we have to confront an elephant in the room.
I was wondering when we'd get to this.
What about the one specific commandment out of the 10 that the source texts note is almost universally ignored or altered by modern Christianity?
You are referring to the 4th commandment, the Sabbath.
Yes. The study points out a profound irony here. It is the only commandment out of the 10 that literally begins with the word remember. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy.
Right.
Yet, historically speaking, it seems to be the only one the Christian world has collectively decided it is perfectly fine to forget.
The inconsistency is striking. I mean, most Christians will fiercely defend the eternal nature of the commandments against murder, theft, adultery, and idolatry.
Absolutely.
But the moment you mention resting on the 7th day, Saturday, the theological narrative abruptly shifts. Suddenly people say, well, that specific rule was just for the Jews.
But as we just spent the last 20 minutes establishing through Paul's writings, there is no just for the Jews category in the New Covenant.
We are all grafted in. Furthermore, Jesus himself addressed the origin of the Sabbath in Mark chapter 2, verse 27. He stated, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath."
He didn't say it was made for the Jew.
Oh.
He used the word man, meaning mankind, humanity as a whole, tracing it all the way back to the creation a week before a single Jew ever existed.
Exactly.
But let me present the standard counter-argument. Most people assert that the day of worship officially changed to Sunday to honor the resurrection of Jesus on the first day of the week.
Right, that's the common belief.
And they argue that because Jesus instituted a new priesthood, the old rules regarding days of worship naturally changed. How does the historical evidence address that?
It addresses it by leaning heavily into ancient contract law, specifically the immovable laws governing a last will and testament.
Oh, contract law again.
The study points to Hebrews chapter 9, verses 16 and 17, which explain how a testament works. It says, "For where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is of force after men are dead, otherwise it is of no strength at all while the testator liveth."
In other words, a will only becomes legally binding the moment the person who wrote it flatlines.
Correct. And then the study pairs that legal definition with Galatians chapter 3, verse 15, which states an unbreakable rule of contracts.
Which is?
Though it be but a man's covenant, yet if it be confirmed, no man disannulleth or addeth thereto.
Okay.
Once the testator dies and the will is ratified, it is permanently locked in amber. You cannot casually cross out a clause, and you certainly cannot add a new codicil.
Oh, I see the timeline issue emerging here.
Jesus is the testator of the new covenant. He died on a Friday afternoon. At the exact moment of his death, his spilled blood legally ratified the new covenant.
The terms were permanently sealed.
He then rested in the tomb on the seventh-day Sabbath, and he resurrected on Sunday, the first day of the week. Therefore, the practice of Sunday worship, which historical records show began to be implemented long after the crucifixion, cannot legally, biblically, or logically be a requirement added to the new covenant.
Because the contract was already sealed on Friday.
If Jesus intended for Sunday to replace the Sabbath as the new day of worship, he was legally obligated to institute that change before he died.
Which perfectly explains the events of Thursday night.
Yes.
He instituted the Lord's Supper, the communion service, on Thursday. He explicitly commanded his disciples to observe a memorial of his broken body and spilled blood before it even happened.
Right.
He did that so it would be legally and formally included in the terms of the new covenant before his death sealed the document the very next day.
It was a vital legal inclusion, but he never uttered a single syllable about altering the day of rest to Sunday. The study asserts that there is zero biblical command for the change.
Wow.
It is entirely a tradition of men instituted by ecclesiastical authorities long after the covenant was permanently sealed.
But wait, let me throw one more verse at you because people will point to Hebrews chapter 7, verse 12.
Okay, let's hear it.
It says, "For the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law." Doesn't that explicitly prove that the law changed when Jesus took over?
It proves that a very specific law changed, and the document clarifies this brilliantly.
Okay, what law?
The law being referenced in Hebrews chapter 7 is not the moral 10 commandments, it is the Levitical law.
Ah, I see.
Under the Old Covenant system, the earthly priesthood was strictly limited to the tribe of Levi, specifically the descendants of Aaron. They managed the physical temple and offered animal sacrifices that, frankly, could never actually erase human sin.
They were just object lessons pointing forward to the ultimate sacrifice of Christ.
Exactly. But Jesus wasn't from the tribe of Levi, he was from the tribe of Judah.
Right.
So under the strict regulations of the Levitical law, Jesus was legally disqualified from being a priest. He couldn't even serve in the earthly temple.
So what did God do?
God instituted a completely new priesthood, an eternal one after the order of Melchizedek, with Jesus serving as the high priest in the heavenly sanctuary.
Okay, that tracks.
Because the entire priesthood was transferred from earthly, flawed Levites to the eternal Son of God, the specific laws governing earthly priests, temple rituals, and animal sacrifices had to be changed. They became entirely obsolete.
That makes perfect sense.
But changing the administrative rules for priests and temple rituals does not in any way abolish the eternal moral code. Changing the priesthood doesn't suddenly make it okay to murder, and it doesn't erase remember the Sabbath day.
We have journeyed through an immense amount of theological and historical territory today.
We really have.
We have moved from the smoke and thunder of Mount Sinai to the agony of the cross. From ancient Roman courtrooms with their wax chirograph-ons to analogies about mortgages, speeding tickets, and stolen bikes.
It's been a ride.
If we try to synthesize everything we have uncovered in these sources, what is the ultimate takeaway?
The overarching takeaway is that the biblical narrative is not a chaotic, disjointed story of a God who constantly changes his mind or a God who maintains two different sets of rules for two different ethnicities.
Right.
It is one brilliantly unified, continuous plan of redemption. The Old Covenant didn't fail because God's moral law was flawed. It failed because the agreement was built on the arrogant, flesh-driven promises of carnal human beings who mistakenly believed they could achieve perfection in their own strength. It was the tragic story of Ishmael.
Well, the new covenant succeeds eternally because it is built entirely on the unbreakable promises of God. It is the miracle of Isaac.
Yes.
God himself promises to take his beautiful, unchanging moral law and miraculously write it directly into the desires and affections of anyone, Jew or Gentile, who places their faith in Jesus Christ, grafting all of them into one unified family tree.
It is the ultimate transition from external compliance to internal revolution.
And that concept of internal revolution brings me to a final thought I want to leave you, the listener, with today. Something for you to deeply consider long after this audio stops playing.
Okay.
We started this deep dive talking about blueprints and contracts and acknowledging our very human desire for clear, visible, external checklists.
We love a good checklist.
We really do. We naturally gravitate toward knowing exactly where the lines are drawn so we can police ourselves and, if we are being honest, so we can judge and police everyone else around us.
That is so true.
But if the entire essence of the new covenant is God performing a miracle to transform our internal desires, rather than just giving us a clipboard to manage our external actions,
If the law has truly relocated from cold stone to a beating heart,
could it be that our modern, heavy reliance on purely external rules, rigid religious checklists, or even the strict societal norms we use to define who is good and who is bad is actually us retreating backward? In our desperate human attempt to be seen as righteous, are we falling right back into the exact same doomed, flesh-driven mentality that the Israelites fell into at the base of Mount Sinai when they proudly declared, "We will do it"?
are we trying to build a house of grace using the obsolete, foreclosed mortgage paperwork of human effort?
Exactly. Are we living our daily lives as children of the bondwoman struggling in our own strength? Or are we truly living as children of the promise?
That is a powerful question.
That is something worth wrestling with. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.